It's also home to some of the most diverse population in Canada. I'm really excited to begin today to do our first Nuit Blanche talk series. A little bit strange to do it in these little box virtual beings, but you know, it's a new dawn, and virtual's it. So tonight we're going to be talking about sites of memory, placemaking, and monuments. We have this incredible lineup of people, such as Sally Han, who's the manager of cultural partnerships at the City of Toronto. We have Natasha Henry, who is a PhD student at York University and also the president of the Ontario Black History Society. We have Branislav Hesselman, who's also the director of culture at the City of Vancouver. And we have Dr. Jolene Rickard, who is an associate professor of history of art and visual studies at Cornell University. We have Dr. Nagam Sinclair, who's an associate professor at the Department of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba, and also a regular columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press. And we have Dr. Carla Taunton, who's an associate professor of art history of contemporary culture at NSCAD University in Halifax and a fellow GLAM member. I'm so happy to have all of you guys here. This conversation tonight is so pertinent in our current climate of mass amounts of people wanting to remove historical statues that continue to tell colonial, racist, and gendered stories of place. We see this happening at a global and local level within our news feed and social media, and there's a political shift to the public removal of these monuments. This is such a critical moment in our collective history, such as this shift is happening. So mass amounts of people are gathering, you know, safely, of course, in COVID, and speaking out about the injustices that are happening, that we're facing in different communities, in different places, nationally, locally, and globally. Each speaker tonight's going to talk a little bit about the important public art projects and cultural shifts within their city spaces, such as curating public art, advocating for it, shifting policy to change to be more inclusive. And this dialogue discussion will be thinking a little bit about the histories of and the importance of telling stories that were excluded or silenced. So, you know, just some light topics for discussion tonight. We're going to start with how do you see the current climate of removal of such figures like John A. Macdonald, Edward Cornwallis, Edgar Ryerson, and then those shifts to the creation of new kinds of projects where we see public art like the memorial to Joshua Glover, Leanne Martin's Missing and Murdered Women's Billboard project. And as many of you guys have been leading or seeing or working towards projects that are trying to shift this framework and recenter stories that have been silenced. So I was thinking or hoping that each one of you would begin to expand on some of your own work from each of your specific places. Nagam, did you want to start?
Sure, yeah. So, Bonjour and Magaduk, Nigan Webadum, Indigenous Cost, Namago Shindo Dim, Niman Windam Omayayin. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to acknowledge all of our relatives who are out there, and we're thinking about them, especially those that are struggling with COVID and those that are, you know, in Manitoba. We've just had our first major hits on our First Nations communities. And so my community particularly for the first time is showing cases. So while most of the country is in a second wave, we are actually just entering a first wave here in Manitowoc, this place that's where the life comes from the water. So bonjour everybody, it's nice to see everybody. I'm just gonna sort of make a few opening comments about some of the work that I do. And since I'm right literally next door to Julie, she's just down the road from me. I guess she starts, you know, in this sort of center place, and then we'll talk about where, you know, other places that come. I'm very humbled to be with so many amazing people from different ancestral territories and all the knowledge that you bring. The work that I do is I'm a professor at the University of Manitoba. So I specialize in aesthetics. And so I speak about aesthetics and I speak about non-English written texts, meaning Indigenous authored texts that have been going back thousands of years, which is in many ways often classified as graphic texts. What I call them is comic books. They're sort of Indigenous comic books going back tens of thousands of years, sequential art. And so our graphic images have always been embedded in a process of story making, whether that's been our birch bark scrolls, or whether that be our rock images, or whether that be our sand teachings, or even that be our so-called oral tradition, which of course is a literary tradition, a literate tradition, and those things that in which we create presence through our breath, that we write down with our breath. And so that's the kind of things that I do. And so part of that is collecting graphic novels at the University of Manitoba. And so we have an installation of Indigenous graphic novels, the only university-based Indigenous graphic novel collection in Turtle Island. And we have 400 different comic books that we have, most of them Indigenous authored, but we also have problematic representations as well to sort of put side by side to discuss on representation. And some of the other work that I do in the city is I work with the Forks historical site, which is traditionally called Nestawea, which is the place where the Assiniboine River meets the Red River. And then the water flows northward. But of course, Nestawea means 3 points. And so it's the original name of Winnipeg. And Nestawea means that Indigenous peoples came from 3 different directions to stay here, to live here, to trade here. And so we have embarked on a project to install public art commemorating Nestawea for a number of years now across Winnipeg. Winnipeg is actually the name for the lake. It's not the name for the city. And so when I often say Winnipeg, what I'm talking about is really this place now called a city, but it's really Nestawea is what we're talking about here. And so some of the things that we've done is we've reasserted places, we've renamed places. We're also inserting a public Medewin lodge for the first time in hundreds of years, since the time periods of our ceremonies being banned. And while this is often classified as art money, it is really life money. It's an ability for us to express ourselves ceremonial with presence. And many of the ceremonial spaces, because they've been in high poverty areas, people are living in those spaces as well. And so we've classified that in terms of looking at some ways that we can create some safety in those spaces as well. So the art that is most often created in Winnipeg is in public spaces where a lot of people, Indigenous peoples with a great deal of poverty are residing. So we have many things to consider which involve life, supporting life within that. And so, a natural fit into that is ceremony. And so there's some really remarkable creation. There's a place called, aptly named Air Canada Park, but Julie has a wonderful piece there, as well as a number of other artists that are doing some great work. And there's also a number of other pieces throughout the city involving murals. So this explosion of murals in Winnipeg that's happened, that's reasserted Indigenous presence, and again in high poverty areas, for the most part to be, give people a sense of place, but also give them a reason to live, a purpose to live, a ceremonial thing that they can see. So there's a project that's being done, creating star blankets that wrap buildings, and those are some of the work that's being done here. Now, just briefly to address what Julie's talking about in terms of the removal of statues and names, I'm constantly and consistently involved in dialogues around Sir John A. Macdonald and the commemoration of Sir John A. Macdonald. In fact, yesterday I was on a conference call with the committee at Queen's University in terms of renaming the law school there, which is named after Sir John A. Macdonald. I'm also involved in Picton, Ontario, involved in the installation of a Sir John A. Macdonald statue. And I'm also very familiar with the activists that I'll say edited the statue in Montreal, right in town here, we've recently edited the Queen Victoria statue by putting a number of additions, beautiful additions. Some people call that red paint on her face, but I call that a beautiful edit, a reminder of where this statue sits. And so these kinds of moments are about commemoration. They're about commemorating genocide. And so statues of places that commemorate people that perpetrated genocide against our people is a reminder of violence. And what it does is, removing a statue is not reconciliation, but removing a statue removes a little bit of the violence, a tiny bit. And what it does is it facilitates a possibility for a dialogue, a possibility for reconciliation. But removing the statue is just making that possibility come to life. It is not reconciliation in any way. It's about the same level as a sports logo, changing a sports team on a football team. That doesn't in any way change the fact that the sport itself is celebrating violence, the history of the exploitation of Indigenous peoples leading up to that team for the tune of millions of dollars is also the celebration of violence. And also the fact that we keep representing Indigenous peoples in reductive, violent, savage ways. And so none of that changes because we change a sports logo, we remove a statue, we rename a building. But what it does do is it facilitates a possibility for conversation in that space, because you would never expect anybody to, if somebody had killed your family, had abused you, and then had put policies in place to ensure that you would suffer for the rest of your life, for the remainder of your days, and all of your ancestors following. And then you were expected to go to a place and there's a statue of that exact person who perpetrated that harm against you. You could never have a fruitful dialogue. So the whole notion that Canada says, well, history, we're removing history by removing statues. No, we are making history is what we're doing. We don't remove history by removing the commemoration of genocidal individuals. What we do is we make history, we facilitate positive spaces. And while, Sir John A. Macdonald, just to lift one thing, he banned homosexuality, he banned abortion, it made it illegal. And he also banned Indigenous peoples, created the residential school system. It's amazing to me that we've changed our attitudes around homosexuality and we've changed our attitudes around abortion, but we haven't really changed our attitudes around Indigenous people. And that shows indications that Sir John A. Macdonald's legacy is secure. And if we're about to engage that in some way, the statues must come down. So miigwech, and thank you very much for giving me that small amount of time.
I laughed earlier, before when we weren't live, that, the most controversy was going to come out on Egon. So definitely a great way to start. That's for sure. I love it. Natasha, do you want to pick it up?
Sure. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Happy to be part of this amazing panel. And let me just say that I am not an artist, so my perspective is a little bit different. So as I was introduced, I'm the president of the Ontario Black History Society, and I am currently a PhD candidate. And the focus of my research is looking at the history of the enslavement of African people in early Ontario. And so, through my different roles, a lot of the work that I do is helping to curate a lot of stories that locate people of African descent in different places, looking at how, for example, through the development over time, how some of these stories have come to be erased. And so a lot of the work that we do at the Ontario Black History Society, as we said, is, creating various resources, offering a range of programs to tell these stories. One quick example is at Richmond and John Streets, Richmond, just near the center there. And that was once one of the areas where some early Black freedom seekers settled and had developed communities and institutions, businesses. And when we look at how Toronto has evolved over time, through colonization and urbanization, a lot of that history has been erased. And so some of the work that we do seeks to resurrect that. Specifically as it relates to my research on the history of enslavement, which is ongoing, a lot of the work that has started to influence, and I hope it continues to influence, is marking particular places where Black people who were enslaved lived, worked, had their families, really in an effort to humanize and their experiences, to humanize them as people who were here, brought through force, and again through the violence of imperialism and colonization, were here nonetheless and lived and contributed. And so, some of the work that I've done so far is I've curated a walking tour with Museum Toronto, and it's called Brought in Bondage. And in looking at the different ways that people have come to reside in Toronto, I take a look at the perspective of those who were enslaved, looking at the particular places, particular sites in downtown Toronto, including where William Jarvis's estate was, looking where, and he enslaved 6 African people, their men, women, and children, looking at the men, women, and children who were also enslaved by Peter Russell, and a few other places. And, what is evident, and when we visit these places initially, what we see are commemorations or acknowledgements of the presences of these colonists, whether through the street names or the names of buildings, or it could be statues, for example, or different monuments. However, there nowhere is there any information about the people who they held in bondage. And so, that's one of the things that I've been doing. And so I've been pleased to see that some of my research has been used to influence some of the recent guerrilla art taking place, where someone has been creating these signs and placing them, so far 3 different signs in Toronto that mark places where people were enslaved reside, and actually highlight, those who enslaved them. So again, looking at William Jarvis, Babe Point, connected here to Toronto, but also in Windsor. And so, I'm happy to see that the use of my research is being used to stimulate conversation and really to think about these historical, very colonial narratives of place, and really, to put forth, to contest how these public spaces have been constructed in very narrow ways, again, to recognize, white dominant cultures and people and colonization. And so, for me, I think it's something that I would like to see ongoing. Again, looking at my work, looking at enslavement across Ontario, and getting different places to engage in these conversations, because we really, for me, one of the end goals is engaging in serious learning and discussion that looks at the complexities of colonization of Indigenous lands here, and looking at how that process of imperialism and colonization led to the forced removal of Indigenous Africans and brought them here to this space, right, by force. And what were those kinds of impacts and interconnections and interactions in the idea of placemaking, and again, to trouble the idea of how public space is it constructed. And so when Nagam talked about, the removal of these monuments, create an opportunity for possible dialogue, and is history making, that we need to, I hope, more collectively come to more of a consensus that we need to challenge, this past construction of public space, and envision something that is more inclusive, and again, problematizes what has been going on so far. And so before I end, one of the ways that I've seen this, more recently you talked about the Joshua Glover statue that was just unveiled, and Quentin Versetti won an award for that. And so, things like that bring awareness to and to acknowledge Black presences in spaces that are often, again, erased and absented, again, are great opportunities for conversation, for learning, and delving into history and marking space in different ways
Thanks, Natasha. I feel so bad. I gave you a PhD, and then I made you a student, and now you're a candidate. And so I'm feeling real bad here. Really. Yeah, thank you. Branislav, do you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Julie. I really appreciate it. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So before I start, I would like to acknowledge that I'm here on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And I would also like to acknowledge that the original languages of these lands are Kunkuminam and Squamish. And I think that's very important for this conversation, because it very much, certainly for the conversation in Vancouver, and from the side of, the city of Vancouver, that very fact actually informs and defines a number of pieces of work that we have been rolling out. And so through this invitation, and again, thank you so much for having me, I had to stop and think a little bit about the inventory of things actually that are in process. and was a little overwhelmed, but then was actually even more overwhelmed by the amount of work that we actually still have ahead of us. And it is the work actually that we have really promised to do through the culture shift, blanketing the city in arts and culture policy that we had actually put forward, and that's our arts and culture plan for the next 10 years. As a part of this conversation, I think one of the biggest questions, and I've heard it from the previous speakers, is whose voices are not heard? Who are the original stewards of these lands? And how can we actually make any contemplations actually of commemoration without understanding the histories, one, and then more importantly, actually daylighting those histories. So daylighting those stories and actually really giving back, not that it was actually ever for us to give it back, but actually providing that space to daylight the languages and daylight also the work that has been done so far. So in my portfolio, I of course oversee public art, but I have grants and also spaces. And through Culture Shift, one of the most important things actually that has been very clear to us from the very beginning has been that we have to commit, and we have done so, to reconciliation. But as the City of Reconciliation, that's incredibly important. But it's actually taking many, many steps further. It's decolonization, and then very much the self-determination of our three host nations. As you mentioned earlier, we are on unceded lands. And so that visibility and voice on the land became one of our main foci. The second piece actually is that this firm commitment to equity and redress. And that has actually been a part of our work and our thinking from the very outset. So again, the reason why this is important is because as the city, we have certain mechanisms to support the community, and one of them is of course grants, the other one is commissioning public art, but we have so many regulatory and policy and planning mechanisms and tools that actually need to embed our commitment to reconciliation and equity in a meaningful way, and so that we can actually really see this change happen and permeate the entire city. So all this to say, when we're looking at commemoration, and we're just at the beginning of doing a major commemoration policy for the city, we're asking a number of different questions. So the questions are, whose voices are heard? Like, whose stories are we telling? Whose histories are we reflecting? And, you know, where do we go beyond these bronze statues that, of course, we're now, but I'm serious, like, is naming a part of this? And I would say, yes, it is. So the city of Vancouver recently renamed two of the major plazas in both Hankaminam and Squamish. And so this is the work that needs to happen. The other piece that is actually underway that I'm very excited about, and I was going to mention it quickly, is cultural mapping of the city of Vancouver. I think it actually needs to be of the entire region, but right now, because we're embarking on a much larger piece of work that will be looking at a Vancouver planned strategy, my whole point is we cannot be planning for future without understanding actually what the original history and stories of these lands were. And only with those original stories and histories can we actually also decide what will happen with those very bronze statues that we're talking about. We have a statue here, it's called Gassy Jack. And it's a terrible story actually of a person who married a 12-year-old Squamish girl. This is not something that we can just take down. I think there is healing that needs to happen with the nation. And so we've been working very closely actually with the nation to look at the good way, the right way actually to address this. So this is just a little tester of what we're doing. As we go on with this conversation, I can give you some more details, but certainly this commitment to a meaningful redress work and to meaningful reconciliation and decolonization embedded in the work that we're doing, imbuing all the work that we're doing, is something that is very much on my mind. And I'll leave it at that.
Awesome, thank you. I was mostly laughing about the monument just because we kind of have a history here in Winnipeg with a very unfamous and then famous version of Louis Riel. And so the first piece that went up, which is actually really quite beautiful, the community didn't want, because they actually wanted the bronze statue, that kind of feeling. And so there was pushback. And so then a second statue was actually created to kind of reminisce that feeling. And I think that it's twofold. It's one, we think that it actually has, you know, we have to be conscious of our collective memories and ideas of what our society is pushing across in all aspects. And then at the same time, people want to be like, well, why couldn't he be memorialized like somebody like John A. Macdonald, right? And so it's this weird tension of that kind of frustration of, you know, we can't imagine stuff outside of that because we actually haven't been able to see it yet. And then the versions that, you know, we're not there yet. And so I think it's going to be interesting as we kind of continue in this climate.
Mm-hmm.
Jolene, I was hoping you would pick it up.
Transkana Sego. Hi, everybody. My name is Jolene Yachiniti Rickard, and I'm located tonight in the Tuscarora Nation territories, which is actually very close to a very important icon of both Indigenous territories and then this notion of American and Canadian space, which is, we're very close to Niagara Falls. I've been involved with several projects that are recently that are looking at the broader question of should we substitute the narrative with just new formations. If earlier representations predominantly are about men and white men, is the moment now to simply just add the discussion and balance it with gendered statements and then complicate it with multiple subjecthoods. And I would argue that as Indigenous peoples, I think we should rethink those responses. And I might share, I'll share with you an organization that I've been working with called Sites of Conscience, which is a global organization. And they're interested in marking public space. And we held a workshop this summer at Gunundagan, which of course is one of the sites of the Seneca Nation. And Gunundagan was significant because it was one of the places that was that a burnt earth campaign was committed against that land and those peoples in the Clinton-Sullivan campaign, which was of course ordered by Hunit Dagayas or George Washington. And it was basically a genocidal burnt earth campaign against the Haudenosaunee people, which was 1779 and, you know, very close to this notion of the birth of a nation. And so how do we mark these spaces? Do we mark these spaces with the same kind of visual markers that in fact have embodied the dispossession and colonization of our lands? And I would argue that that we shouldn't, and that we should really rethink the kind of gestures that we're making on the land. And we have to, I think, begin to think about the gesture left by our ancestors, by the people who came before us. And so in a place like Gunundagan, one of the markings of the land are huge oak savannas. In the Haudenosaunee territories, at various points in time, just there would be you know, miles and miles of productive or planted, what today we fetishize as heritage seed, but what sustained our people at that period of time. And so I'm conflicted over a recent decision in a consultation that I was involved with, which involved a number of Haudenosaunee people. And it was put upon us by the National Women's Organization that had been tasked with including a Haudenosaunee voice at Seneca Falls. And so a monument is going in at Seneca Falls. It's reproducing this moment of the narrative. The monument will include, of course, not of course, but just the inclusion or the expansion of this notion of the beginnings of the suffragette movement is located in Seneca Falls, which is in Gayagono territory, or the territory of the Cayuga Nation, which is next to Seneca Lake. And I'm close to this project because it's at the other end of the lake from the university that I work at. And so the goal there was to begin to complicate that early movement, the early suffragette movement, and to recognize the work of Harriet Tubman, Martha Coffin Wright, and Sojourner Truth. And so they wanted somebody of equal stature from Haudenosaunee territories. And it opened up a very interesting discussion that I think each of our communities needs to have. And it's that, do we share our most important storied and cosmological ideas and figures in these spaces? Or do we bring forward people who were contemporaries of the people that are being represented at that period of time? And it was really interesting because the story of the Gayagono is that they were dispossessed and now they're making a return to their homelands. And so they were very interested in marking that space with a clan mother of that time. And at the same time, it is considered in the United States a national space. And the end result wasn't a Gayagono clan mother, but it was an Oneida woman who upheld the principles of peace, power, and righteousness, or the Gayanagoa, the Great Law. And her name is Carol Cornelius Kellogg, who is Oneida. And so I think it's important to bring our histories forward and to bring peoples forward that have made a difference but who carried our values. But at the same time, I would argue that I feel I wasn't satisfied that the entire representation is going to be a bronze figurative monument, which I think undermines the potency of the potential message at that period of time, because I do not think we can escape the materiality of a bronze figurative monument. I think that is something that will be consistently connected to war and male, the heroic male, and colonization. And so I just challenge all of us that are tasked with working on these kinds of projects to not only consider the important histories that we are being asked to mark, but to also pay very close attention to how it is visualized or the materials that we're using. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Jolene. I mean, you're raising really great questions that hopefully we'll get some time to kind of chat about. I was going to throw the ball over to Carla and see where we go.
Okay, I'm just mindful of time, so I'll try to keep it quite concise, which sometimes is challenging for me. Thank you all for these really, I think, urgent perspectives, and for the work that you're all doing across the lens. I'm speaking to you from Mi'kmaq territory. I'm an uninvited guest here. I'm actually from the unceded territories of the West Coast. And I really came to this work as a white settler thinking through decolonial practice during my PhD at Queen's, where I walked past the Sir John A. Macdonald monument most mornings going to school, of which I had the opportunity of working with an incredible emerging Métis scholar, Dr. Erin Sutherland, who actually created a whole dissertation project of encountering that monument by bringing in performance artists. And my work in my PhD was looking at the work of incredible performance artists such as Anishinaabe artist Rebecca Belmore, and thinking through memorialization as a counter monument, or as Indigenous understandings of memorialization, and learning about histories, say, of Wounded Knee Massacre in the 1890s in the United States, but learning it through not the archival documents of the colonial body of the United States, but through the perspectives of Belmore's collaboration and working through the family's experiences of that site, and thinking about her incredible memorialization to survivors of residential schools in her piece Victorious, which I first saw in 2010 at the National Arts Centre in Ottawa. So in my view, and in the work that I've had the opportunity to kind of collaborate with, and living here now in Mi'kma'ki, monuments that we have present currently, such as the Cornwallis Monument that was removed from the city of Halifax, it's just another project of amnesia making. The colonial project here in Canada is about forgetting Indigenous perspectives in the context of Halifax, the erasure of Mi'kmaq perspectives and presence and sovereignties, but also of Black histories of diaspora, Black loyalists here in the context of Halifax and Nova Scotia. And the fact that currently at that park, we have nothing. It's empty. And there's a lot of dialogue and a lot of consultation to think through what are the most effective means forward. And in this context, I love the conversation around language. I live somewhere where there's one founding nation. It's Mi'kmaq. It's a Mi'kmaq site. And we actually have an incredible roadmap forward if we look to not only the treaties of peace and friendship from 1725, which outline a reciprocal dialogue and relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples here, but also the Wabanaki Confederacy that predates that. That's an Indigenous practice of protocol and policy. So I'm hoping that as we move forward thinking about these monuments, that we look to how can we, as Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, come together and think through Indigenous protocols that I think can as Jolene was talking about, can actually show us and imagine some ways of memorializing not only a place, but important events, individuals that through our history writing in Canada have erased and consistently have removed these really powerful, and sometimes very difficult histories. But if we are to decolonize, and I think decolonization is for everybody and different roles and responsibilities, these stories have to be at the forefront, and they need to be self-determined by communities but from which who have been erased from the story. So I could talk and talk and talk, but I'll leave it there because I know we can have a dialogue.
I know, but there's so much good monuments in terms of some of the conversations around Africaville and like all I was like, you got to just say a little tiny snippet there.
Okay, well, we can think about it. Recently, we have the Africville Museum, and that site, and for so many Canadians, I didn't know about Africville when I moved. I didn't know about it until I moved to Halifax. I knew snippets of it, but I didn't understand that there was this absolutely thriving community in Halifax that was forcibly removed, and that it was actually turned into a dog park. And that happened here in Halifax in the 1980s. And now there's this incredible historic society and a presence that's led by some really incredible elder community members here in Halifax. And there hasn't been a national apology, but there's talk about how could that be addressed? And again, what would that look like? And how can we imagine that? Again, needing to be self-determined by community members. The first time I learned about the Cornwallis and who Cornwallis was, who brought forward as a leader here, British official, he was the one that brought forward bounty law against Mi'kmaq, so a project of genocide. And it was actually through the work of the incredible performance artist Ursula Johnson. And in 2010, a part of Nocturne, which is our night festival, so shout out to Nocturne, Ursula created an unbelievable performance where she actually created a headpiece that was a woven basket but put upside down. And it was a symbolic removal of that happened with an honor song, a Mi'kmaq honor song being played at the same time, and brought forward really an awareness that people weren't aware that there was a bounty law that was still actually on the books in the legislature here in Nova Scotia. So those kinds of, I think, interventions, interactions, moments of public engagement are absolutely incredible. I'm really excited to see what happens at Nocturne this year with Lindsay Dobbin curating the anchor projects. Julie and I are working on a GLAM project with Dr. Heather Gugliarte. It's really amazing because we're actually using the site of the library. We're going to try to wrap as much Indigenous presence around that beautiful glass public building And there's some really great engagement with local Black stories as well. So we're seeing more and more through these kinds of night festival moments here in the Atlantic. But in terms of presence, of Mi'kmaq presence, there are two major installations. There's Alan Sillyboy's work at the Commons, and there's a recent installation by Jordan Bennett, which is over in Dartmouth at the new Sportsplex there. So I know the city is currently meeting with people and discussing, how can there be a stronger presence, and thinking about Vancouver as kind of our pinnacle in the city, or sorry, in Canada. But how can we move forward with that leadership and having artists, community members, elders, thinkers, curators, maybe someone like myself, can come together to think through and imagine some new possibilities. Did I do that okay? Yeah.
Thanks, Car. I'm like, whoa, Vancouver. I'm like, whoa, let's bring it back to Toronto here. Sorry.
Well, of course, Toronto. I'm from Vancouver, so I have a little bit of a.
Don't drink that Kool-Aid. Okay, Sally, you're up. You got to bring it back to Toronto here for a little bit.
All right, no problem. Hi, I'm Sally, and I'm the manager of cultural partnerships at the city. And it's so interesting to listen to what everybody has to say, because so much of the conversations that you're having are similar to the conversations that we're having at the city, both around public art, around public space, around placemaking. And there are really key conversations in the city in a very, very big way. Some of the work that we're trying to do and inform the city overall has been led by some of the events this summer, certainly through Black Lives Matter and a lot of the political events. Right now at the City of Toronto, there's a report being done about the renaming of Dundas Street. And Henry Dundas was a British, actually a Scottish parliamentarian whose actions elongated the persistence of slavery in Canada prior to the Emancipation Act. So in Scotland, they decided actually to not to take down a memorial, I think, and there's a conversation going on in Toronto. If any of you know Toronto, it's a major thoroughfare throughout the city. So it's a very, very big job to do that. And so we've had lots of conversations about what is the way to create space, to whether removal is one, renaming is one, reinterpretation is one. And I think that question of reinterpretation or removal or renaming of public spaces, public monuments, public names is a broad conversation that requires a lot of participation. And so that's sort of the way forward that's going right now in terms of a report to City Hall, is how to have this conversation in a right way. The City of Toronto currently has just finished a public art, a 10-year public art strategy, where we really did try to go out and include the voices in that development of that strategy that were not the so-called regular art voices, but in fact, larger community voices. And we instead of asking only people to show up to events that we ran, we very much did a different kind of facilitation process and went to communities where they are and asked them about what they thought public art could be about in the city. And so our 10-year public strategy was called Creativity and Community Everywhere, because so much of it was about trying to take things like public art and commissions outside the downtown core, where it's so tied to real estate development, which means it's so tied to capitalism, which means it's so tied to a certain kind of dominant, power base, I would say, and trying to figure out how we can use public spaces and public public projects to do more to engage multiple narratives. Now, obviously, like many Torontonians, I'm a settler to a land that's been 12,000, 15,000 years inhabited and settled and stewarded by so many different nations, Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and Mississauga's the credit now, and Anishinaabe for sure. And so we need to do a job of of acknowledging all of those voices that are absent, frankly, in our conversation. And I think one of the things we will do is the Indigenous, the residential school survivors memorial in Nathanville Square, which is one of the most prominent city sites. And I think in terms of the recommendations of Truth and Reconciliation Commission, at least from what I know right now, I don't think there are other provincial capitals that have advanced their conversations. And I have to give all due credit. This was very much driven by the Indigenous community themselves, and through an Indigenous organization who has pushed the city along to make this happen. So we're working on a commission with Solomon King and with a number of organizations who are trying to be very inclusive of the huge number of Indigenous voices and nations that need to be represented as a part of that presence. As well, we're looking at public art memorials in other places. So I'm glad that you mentioned the Joshua Glover's piece. That's a brand new commission. We have a ways to go to make it happen. One of the things we need to do is to bring resources to that project. It doesn't have the kind of resources that it needs. And so my job is to make sure we get it there. And those are in fact some of the issues around how we memorialize events at all. And this brings me to the larger questions and projects about what we choose to memorialize and how we choose to memorialize them. I agree completely about the idea that bronze sculptures are so, I think, so redolent of sort of men on horses, heroic kind of powers. And, you know, to have conversations with that is an interesting thing to do. So I just want to mention that one of the public art pieces that we've recently installed is a piece by Vancouver artist Mifana McLeod, and she has chosen as a commission for a public art a giant bronze, but it's a bronze donkey. And the reason it's a bronze donkey with big pink casts is, and it's a baby donkey. The donkey itself has a little history. It was called Primrose, and it was it had sort of broken front arms at birth, and they felt so sorry for the donkey, didn't think it was going to survive, that they actually put pink casts on it, and eventually it grew up and became okay. And even though it's in no way explicit, and it can be read many ways, because the artwork was commissioned for a site, the park that's right beside a church. The artist decided that one of the most interesting ways into this public art piece and this site was to have a conversation with the fact that it's on Bay Street, which is right down towards the biggest power bases in Canada in terms of financial power. At the same time, it's this big, very childlike, lovely donkey with pink casts that invite children to write on the casts the way you used to write on people's casts who had casts on them. And above all else, I think she sort of valorized this donkey with nobody on it, because she said the donkey is an animal that's the second. It's the hardest working animal. It works so hard, but it doesn't get any credit. It's not on statues, and it's kind of, you know, this secondary animal, and she wanted to give the secondary animal presence. And I thought of it very much as a sort of a feminist work that sort of put, even though without any explicit ways, into disabled rights right into the sort of public sphere, like all these kinds of multiple ways of reading that work, which I think a really strong piece of art does. And I'll just, you know, finish off by saying public art and monuments of any kind, I think, have to invite conversation, and multiple conversations. And I mean, I'm a great believer in that notion that democracy is the refuge of the uncertain, and I'm uncertain, and uncertainty is the refuge of hope. So I do like that art often allows us to have conversations, because we're constantly trying to struggle with notions of truth, of belonging, of community, of all those things that are not defined in a way that don't have meaning without people making those meanings together.
Thanks, Sally. I know this is going to be so hard. I just feel like I want everybody to talk, and I was just like, oh, maybe I should make them 90 minutes instead of 60 minutes. But then I'm just worried that it's just so much Zoom exhaustion that people will be like, I can't do it. Does anybody want to just add any quick little bit?
I mean, I've been throwing in the chat a little bit, just I really love Jolene. I know I get a gold star, by the way, for being the most amount of chat people. Anyways, and so you know, I just want to reflect on some of Jolene's points. I mean, I love all the things Jolene was contributing in terms of us really thinking about what is a monument, and then also the interrogating the whole notion of monumenting, and I love that. And I've been a big advocate for they're like, well, we should put a new monument here. And I'm like, how about green space? How about we acknowledge the animals and the beings that are existing? So what's ended up happening is a lot of architectural firms that I've worked with now are putting in monuments of the former green space, which isn't the whole point. That's not the point. Like, so there's a former creek that went through downtown Winnipeg, for example. And now there's an actual sculpture that resembles the creek. I'm like, how about we rebuild the creek? Hey, that's, you know, how about we honor the animal life that is, anyways, okay. What I wanted to say here is, I just want to pose a question to throw it out there. I mean, we don't have time to really have a big discussion around this, but I really like that Jolene really provoked my thinking around this, because so many times when I'm invited to these conversations on Sir John A. Macdonald statues and names and et cetera, and I mean, because I write about them in my columns pretty frequently, I'd say statues is right up there, top 5 things I've ever written about, is the kind of people going, well, can't we just add a plaque to that monument and sort of contextualize it? I'm not a fan of that, and here is why, is because I think it just ornamentalizes it maintains the violence in the space. It simply adds maybe some context to that violence. That's not adding to a conversation. That's not facilitating a conversation. And I really don't like how that's somehow the answer to violent statues, or the memorialization of genocidal individuals, that somehow we just add a little, you know, sort of asterisk beside them. Like, that is exactly the problem in the first place. The issue is that we have to dismantle colonialism. We have to not only dismantle colonialism, but we also have to rebuild our spaces and our relationships together. That's what treaty is all about. And anyways, you can obviously tell what my opinion is. So I was meant to be a question, but now then I just I killed the question, sorry. But I just, I really get frustrated with that idea of this whole idea of, like, if we just add a little plaque beside the Sir John A. Macdonald statue and say, hey, he was a genocidal maniac, like, or hey, that even amongst his time, like, my biggest thing about, he was not a man of his time. He was even a genocidal maniac for his time. His own party separated from him. Said, you are too violent, which, anyways, there should even be a question about removing Sir John A. Macdonald from every statue and every building in the as far as I can see. Anyways, I just wanted to throw that out there, and my frustration around those particular additions to public art. Anyways, thanks, Nuit Blanche.
Anybody else want to throw one last thought in?
Maybe just the, again, to that question about, artists that are truth tellers, and I mentioned this in the chat as well. We really need to make sure that they're leading the way as we're looking at a discourse. And ultimately what all of this is about, and what it needs to be about, is meaningful discourse. And the reason why I actually say that is because I'm going to put a link in the chat in a second. There's a really fabulous piece of work that was done by Ceasewise and Riley. It's called Conciliation or Remediation. You probably know it. And it's commemoration, actually. Like, that's what it is. Paul Wong just did a piece on what was previously Vancouver City Hall in Chinatown, where some of the most racist decisions were made against Chinese people. That's commemoration. And so, to kind of Jolene's point, it's all of these things that are much farther ahead when we're thinking actually about what commemoration could be. And this is why our artists are really our pathfinders and truth tellers.
100%. And that's always been the case. Thinking through kind of since time immemorial within the context of what is now Canada and the United States, Indigenous artists and storytellers have been the ones who have been imagining the past, the present, and the future. And so I think continuing to look to the incredible breadth of making across this country by artists, BIPOC artists, and there's burgeoning white settler artists who are really thinking through critically these ideas. And I think, for me as an art historian, as a curator, I'm so excited to see also this emerging generation. They're just absolutely fierce and resilient, and bringing forward such important commentary that really kind of to the forefront brings forward decolonial practice, anti-racist practice. And for me, in my territory where I'm living now, the idea of treaty making, and how do we embody that in the daily basis. And the monuments and the public works that we interact with need to reflect that 100%.
Thanks, Carla. Jolene, you wanted to add? I got your note. Oh, you're on mute.
Yes, thank you. I'm wondering if there's an important distinction of what's happening in the United States in contrast to Canada, and that in the United States, there is a connection between an anti-racist discourse and the removal of these monuments. And what I'm hearing in your language is that there's a more present sense of the decolonial. And so I think, you know, in the United States, the dialogue is a binary. And I don't think that either spaces in North America or in the Americas, or we could argue globally, that we're going to be able to have systemic change until the broader framework of creating a consciousness of deconstructing colonialism is the broader framework of which systemic racism is part of that, because the condition of the settler state demands it. And I think, and so in the United States, this has been definitely a difficult argument, because right now the flashpoint is so much directed on the notion of racism as this flashpoint. But I would argue that that racism is nested within the colonial and the ongoing colonial. Thank you.
Thanks, Jolene. I think we're just gonna I mean, this is the problem, is like you get all these incredible people into the virtual room, and I'm just like, oh, can I just get another tea? I could sit here for another hour talking about it. It's just such a pervasive topic, and there's so many layers to it. I also want to say it's so exciting to see Mishana in the chat and some other names, and it's just like warms my heart, and it makes me so happy to have such incredible colleagues like yourselves and friends who are doing this really amazing critical work in all these different geographic locations. And I can't thank you enough for your time and energy to come on the first Nuit Blanche talk series. And I'm really excited to see where we kind of keep going and how it kind of impacts, and even just listening to some of you that are on the podcast and thinking about some of those layers, I'm really excited about the kind of future stuff. I, of course, want to say thank you to the continued support for our partners at the University of Toronto Scarborough and the Dorothy McCarthy Gallery. I also want to recognize the support of the province of Ontario, the Celebrate program grant. I want to say Chimagwich, Marcy, to our guests. You bring incredible energy and voices to the table, and I really can't express my gratitude enough. And, you know, for bringing your good minds, good hearts, and good voices. Obviously provocative, critical, and engaged. And we have another talk. It's just going to be rapid fire on Tuesday with the New World Order of Gathering and Performing on September 22nd. And thank you so much for your time and energy. And of course, Chimagwich Marcy to the University of Winnipeg for being our host tonight. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Julie.
Thanks, Julie.
Thanks, Julie.
Julie. Thanks so much.
Julie.
Thank you.
Take care. Have a good night, everyone.
Yeah, you too. Awesome. Thanks, guys. Can you hear me or no?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Julie.
Oh, thank you. You guys are all great. I was like, man, we could do this for another full hour. I was just like, we're going.
I know. I know.
I might reach out to all of you. I just,
Yes. Evan, can you take us off?
Jolene. Oh, she leave?